Okay, I first want to thank Jackie and Sarah for having helped me start this and actually get here. Then I also have to thank the Office of Global Affairs, the Office of the Vice President for Research, the UConn Humanities Institute, the Creative Writing Program, the Department of English, and also the Department of LCL. And I want to thank Peter for having accepted our invitation.
Thank you.
Now, Peter is a literary translator. I think one of the best known or best ones working in the States today. He's also an editor, a fellow in Greek and classics at Columbia. His recent translations include Sophocles' Theban trilogy, the essential writings of Rousseau, and works by Machiavelli, Gogol, Tolstoy, and Voltaire. Just that. He co-edited A Century of Greek Poetry, 1900 to 2000, and the anthology of the Greek poets, Homer to the Present, which Norton published in 2010. Peter's a Guggenheim Fellow and was awarded the Penn Translation Prize for 6 early stories by Thomas Mann, and the National Translation Award for The Undiscovered Chekhov. His translation of the complete works of Isaac Babel received the Koret Jewish Literature Award. His current projects include The Exile Diaries of Solzhenitsyn. I think it's a little piece, right, of 2,000 pages.
I think 2,500.
2,500 pages.
Which is part one.
Which is part one, right. Solzhenitsyn is not yet in Vermont, but is outside of the Soviet Union. And also a little side project, which you've sort of left to the side for a little while, but you're coming back to it, The Confessions of Augustine. And Peter's also very involved in the preservation of endangered languages in Greece, because in addition to modern Greek in Greece, there are 6 other languages spoken, which no one pays much attention to, except a few people like Peter. So his talk today is entitled, I don't know if you're remaining truthful to the title, Translating the Classics. Yes? Which doesn't mean translating the Greco-Romans, but translating the classics in the generic sense. Okay? So, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thinking back over the authors and works I've translated in the past 25 years, I've come to realize that my most recent translation, The Essential Writings of Rousseau, sums up in a surprising way those 2.5 decades of work. As a translator, you have to start afresh with every author you translate, to seek out new vocabularies and new rhythms and registers that reflect the author's style. You have to get to know the author in a very essential way. But in translating the essential writings of Rousseau, I found myself facing a number of different Rousseaus with remarkably unrelated styles. Every work of Rousseau had to be approached with an entirely new mindset. Rousseau, the author of Confessions, is quite different from Rousseau, the author of The Social Contract, or the author of Emile, or the author of Rêveries or Julie. None of the writers I had translated before Rousseau, even formidable literary stylists such as Machiavelli, Chekhov, or Isaac Babel, had the capacity or the need to entirely reinvent themselves with every new work. It is this elusive quality that makes Rousseau and his texts particularly fascinating and especially difficult for a translator. Translating Voltaire, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, or Thomas Mann, you are translating intricate and multi-layered texts, but those authors' personalities do not affect or in fact invade their writing in vital ways as Rousseau's personality invades his work. Every translator has to try to read between the author's lines, but in Rousseau's writing there are many different nuances between and behind the words, and most of these nuances conflict and clash with each other. He created literary works but denounced literature. He was a lifelong protégé of the aristocracy, but also a denouncer of the aristocracy, and the author of The Social Contract. He was the author of Emile, the single most influential book on education and child rearing, and yet he was the father of 5 children whom he abandoned at the doorstep of a local workhouse. His children's fates are known to him and to us. He wrote the opera Le Devin du Village and other theatrical works, but also wrote the letter to D'Alembert denouncing the theatre. A further twist is Rousseau's own awareness of his incompatible positions. As he wrote in his introduction to the play Narcisse ou l'amant de lui-même, I will continue to say in all honesty all the ill I think of the literary arts and those who cultivate them, and will think no less of my own works for it. It is true that people would say someday, and yet the self-proclaimed enemy of the sciences and the arts wrote and published plays for the theatre. And this statement will indeed be a most bitter satire, not of me, but of my time. So I believe that translation is an act of mimicry. We mimic a text in another language and perhaps another age, in an attempt to recreate it for readers in our language and our time. Mimicking Rousseau's text, the translator then has to bring across the words, the meaning, and all the subtexts and hints hidden behind the words. Attempting to mimic Rousseau's Confessions was without doubt the most difficult translation I've undertaken, and probably almost as difficult as Babel, as we were saying yesterday, our Russian, but it was, I would say, the most difficult. In many ways, a translator is the closest reader of a text. Rousseau announces at the beginning of his Confessions, I intend to present my peers with a man in all the truth of nature, and this man will be me, myself alone. In approaching the Confessions, I had to try to capture that forthright and spontaneous tone, the professed honesty and plain-spokenness, but also the contrived effects and the carefully planned sentences that Rousseau clearly edited and re-edited to achieve the lightness and spontaneity of this seemingly candid presentation of himself. There is so much going on in the text, a constant change of rhythms and styles within the passages, particularly at the many key moments of the work. I'd like to read a passage where Rousseau presents his idyllic, or perhaps not so idyllic, childhood in the village of Beausset under the care and tutelage of Pastor Lambertier, with his beloved, or not so beloved, cousin Bernard. Living with my cousin Bernard in such tranquility brought me close to him, and my feelings for him quickly became even more affectionate than they had been for my brother, and these feelings have never faded. Bernard was a tall boy, extremely thin and lanky, as gentle in spirit as he was weak in body, and he did not abuse overmuch the preference he was shown in the house as my guardian son. Our studies, our amusements, and our tastes were the same. We were alone. We were the same age. We were both in need of a friend. One could say that to part us would have been to destroy us, though we had few opportunities to demonstrate our attachment to each other. It was an extreme attachment, and not only could we not imagine being apart for an instant, we could not imagine ever being separated. We were both of a spirit prone to tenderness, agreeable if we were not being constrained, and so we were always in accord. If through the preference of those who looked after us, he had some advantage over me, when we were alone, I had an advantage over him, which restored the balance. In our studies, I whispered the answers to him when he faltered. When I had finished my lesson, I would help him with his, and in our leisure, my more active interests always set the pace. Our characters were so well matched, and the friendship that united us so true, that in the more than 5 years that we were almost inseparable, as much in Beausset as in Geneva, though we often fought, we never had to be separated, and our fights never lasted more than a quarter of an hour, nor did we ever tell on each other. These remarks might be thought childish, but they perhaps provide an example that might be unique ever since there have been children. My life at Beausset suited me so well that its only fault was that it did not last longer, molding my character completely. Its foundation was feelings that were tender, warm-hearted, and peaceful. I believe that no individual of our species has been by nature more free of vanity than I. So this is, I don't know if you feel that powerhouse of his coming and going and stating something and then deconstructing it somehow. The book that I translated for Modern Library before the Essential Writings of Rousseau was The Essential Writings of Machiavelli. There, my constant struggle was to recreate the elegant and multi-layered Italian Renaissance style of which Machiavelli was an accomplished master. There's beautiful music in his words, even if what Machiavelli is saying with them might be frightening. In chapter 3 of The Prince, he writes, "Men must be either flattered or eliminated, because a man will readily avenge a slight grievance, but not one that is truly severe. Hence the offence done a man must be of the kind that cannot incur vengeance." So this is, however, an unfair quotation, as it underlines the ruthless cynicism that we associate with Machiavelli. But there's much more to him. My mission in editing and translating this panorama of his work was to reintroduce him as a literary writer of incredible range. We think of him as the author of The Prince, but he also wrote the great 3-volume discourses of the first 10 books of Titus Livy, which today we usually refer to as the discourses. He wrote the novella Belfagor, the fictional biography, the life of Castruccio Castracani. He wrote The Persecution of Africa, a first-person narrative in the voice of a Christian cleric who was besieged by Vandals in northern Africa. And wild and witty plays such as The Mandrake. And he wrote the great historical chronicle, Florentine Histories. In an early piece called How Cesare Borgia Killed the Generals Who Conspired Against Him, Machiavelli writes of the brutal and cunning means by which Borgia eliminated rivals who crossed him. The controlled prose that describes the mounting menace of Borgia's murderous tactics is given a touch of lyricism, as Machiavelli retards the action. Listen to how he describes the idyllic landscape just before the brutal massacre. Whoever approaches Senigallia has on his right the mountains, with foothills that come so close to the sea that there is often only a narrow strip of land between them and the waves. Even in those places where the foothills are further inland, the strip is never more than 2 miles wide. Senigallia lies a bow's shot from these foothills and less than a mile away from the shore. There's a little river by the city that washes the walls facing toward Fano, and then the brutality starts. So in translating Machiavelli's colloquial language, that is also an important issue. In his time, high literature was generally written in Latin. In fact, the contract for his last great work, Florentine Histories, specified that he could choose to write either in Latin or Tuscan. Machiavelli did indeed choose, as he almost always did, a new vibrant Italian based on the Tuscan speech of Florence. He was particularly interested in capturing real live language. In his play The Mandrake, there's much colorful Tuscan speech. What was particularly fascinating for the translator is Machiavelli's rendering of everyday language with all its shades and nuances. In this scene, an excited woman turns to a friar about fantasies she still has involving her dead husband. So the woman says, here's a florin for you to say a requiem for my dead husband's soul every Monday for the next 2 months. He was a rough brute of a man, but my flesh is so weak and I can't help feeling all the flutter when I think of him. Do you believe he's in purgatory? The friar, he definitely is. Woman, I'm not so sure myself. You remember what he used to do to me from time to time? Oh, how often I came running to you about that. I used to try to get away from him, but he always managed to corner me. Ah, God in heaven. While I was working on the essential writings of Machiavelli, I was also translating Sophocles' Theban plays. One of the joys of reading Sophocles in Greek is the stark clarity of his language. In his monologues, dialogues, and choral odes, the lines are crafted to shed every extraneous element. This creates his powerful dramatic voice. As an anonymous biographer wrote a little over a century after Sophocles' death, with a mere half line or a single word, he creates an entire character. In the language of his tragedies, Sophocles combined a compelling mix of registers and dialects. There were elements of a more ancient and stark Doric Greek, particularly in the choral odes, and also moments of melodious epic Ionian. One of Sophocles' innovations is his strategic use of colloquial and not formal Athenian Attic. In his plays, we see colloquial elements such as we find in the wild comedies of Aristophanes, but which we would never encounter in the more staid tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles' predecessor. Sophocles' mix of registers would have been clear to his Athenian audience, as perhaps Shakespeare's similar linguistic feats would have been to his audience almost 2,000 years later. Macbeth, his hands bloodied by murder, says, "Know this, my hand will rather the multitudinous seas in Carnadine, making the green one red." So Shakespeare juxtaposes exotic Latinate terms with the simplest Anglo-Saxon words. Another Sophoclean strategy was to bring to the stage figures from ordinary life who speak to the grand protagonists in a language colored with colloquial expression, which posed another problem for the translator. They're real people emerging from a stylized setting, bringing a new degree of realism to the stage, which is difficult to convey in English. The messenger and, more markedly, the shepherd in Oedipus the King are examples of this, as is the guard in Antigone. The traditional function of the unannounced messengers in Greek tragedy is to be the bringers of news or information that will change the course of the plot. But in the case of the guard in Antigone, Sophocles has created one of the liveliest and most fleshed out characters in Greek tragedy. The translator must capture this with all its color. The guard's lively speech and musings, his witty and garrulous digressions, his fearful hesitations at how Creon might react to the news he's about to reveal, all dangerously test Creon's patience. The guard has over 100 lines of ponderous speech and fast dialogue to impart his information, challenging Creon in what might be the first example, I think, of a passive-aggressive exchange. So annoying him with his prattling truisms. Creon is so infuriated by the guard that he abandons his formal literary language, slipping into colloquialisms himself. "Oh, what a babbler you are," splatters. "Oimeos lalimai dilon," he breaks out. During this exchange between Creon and the guard, Sophocles employs yet another dramatic strategy. The chorus interrupts the guard's string of speeches and dialogue, reciting Sophocles' most elegant and famous ode, the Ode to Mann. There are many wonders, but none more wondrous than man. He crosses the grey seas in wintry southern winds, cutting through engulfing waves. He tames earth, the most exalted of the gods, the imperishable, the inexhaustible, following his plough year after year as his tribe of horses furrows the soil. Sophocles' most surprising use of Athenian colloquialisms, however, is when his royal protagonists, in moments of anger or high drama, abandon formal language. They're so shocked by what's happening that they fall out of character, in a sense. This translator must be on the alert for this, otherwise Sophocles' wonderful dramatic device gets lost in translation. In Antigone, for instance, Antigone begs her sister Ismene to help her bury their fallen brother. When Ismene refuses but promises to keep the secret, Antigone, exasperated, slips into colloquial Athenian. "Oime katavda." Go ahead, tell everyone. You'll be more hateful if you keep silent and not announce it to all. In another dramatic high point in Antigone, during Creon's catastrophic exchange with his son Haemon, which will lead directly to the disastrous climax of the play, Creon in his anger again falls from elevated dramatic Greek into colloquial speech. The Creon, "Slave to a woman, don't provoke me with your prattle." Haemon, "Do you wish to speak, and having spoken hear no answer?" Creon, "Ha, is that what I wish? Like Aliphes? Well, by Olympus, know that you'll pay for this string of insults." In the golden age of Athens, Sophocles was praised as the Attic bee, not for the sting of his language, but for its honey. Today, it is impossible for us to gauge the full range of Sophocles' stylistic prowess. Of over 120 plays he created, only 7 survive. Most of Sophocles' plays were lost in the Middle Ages when the Crusaders attacked the libraries of Byzantium. So while I was working on all these projects, I was also one of the editors and translators of the anthology for Norton, the Greek poets, Homer to the present. It is the first anthology in English, or in fact in Greek or French or German, that shows the continuum of Greek poetry over 3 millennia. The section I was principally responsible for was Byzantium, which has been generally seen as a dark period in which dour monks composed Christian chants and scribes attempted to write in faulty, half-forgotten classical Greek. The great classical era had ended, but what has traditionally been perceived as the tragic end of the golden age of Greek civilization can also be seen as the beginning of a new way of writing, the first steps away from the strictures of classical Greek models to early modern and modern writing. The first poet in my Byzantine section is Clement of Alexandria, who lived in the 2nd century CE and had converted to Christianity. His were among the first Christian poems, but what I find particularly interesting as a translator is that the poetry has all the fervor of a new convert, but that the poet is still searching for a Christian language in which to express this fervor. I'd like to read you a short excerpt from one of his hymns in which he speaks of Jesus Christ with what seems like wild pagan language. He addresses him as bridle of untamed horses, wing of hovering bird, helm of steady ship, shepherd of royal lambs, fisher of men saved from the sea of evil, you who coax unsullied fish from hostile waves with sweet life, holy shepherd of the flock of the word, guide us, king of untouched children, Jesus Christ, heavenly milk from sweet bride's breast. The corpus of Christian poetry from Byzantium is formidable and also surprisingly ruthless in that major poetic battles and skirmishes were being conducted across the Greek-speaking world, which extended far beyond today's Greece into Asia Minor, Africa, and the Mediterranean. The 11th century poet Christophoros of Mytilene writes of a literary rival, "How much better if an ox were to sit on your tongue than for your poems to plod like oxen over fields." A little haiku, nothing more. There were indeed two sides to Christophoros of Mytilene, the poet who wrote and composed poetry calendars commemorating all the feasts of the Orthodox Christian liturgical year, and the unforgiving satirist and polemical poet. Let me read you a short excerpt from a poem in which he attacks an abbot for his zeal in gathering Christian relics, such as the bones of saints. So to Father Andreas, gatherer of bones. Many say, I know not if this be true, but I do believe it, that you, Holy Father, rejoice when you acquire venerable bones of ascetics or revered holy martyrs, and that you have many coffers of relics, which you open for all your friends to see. 10 hands that belong to the martyred Saint Procopius, 15 jaws belonging to Holy Theodosius, at least 8 legs belonging to Saint Nestor, no less than 4 heads belonging to St. George, 5 breasts of martyred Barbara, 12 femurs of the glorious martyr Demetrius, 20 thigh bones of Pandelemon. Oh, what bounty! It goes on and on. The attack increases with momentum over many verses. As I see, you have a burning faith that presented with a relic you neither doubt nor hesitate. And as this is so, I will procure for you something wondrous free of charge. How about the thumb of Enoch the thrice blessed, who was translated, living from this world? Or how about one of the buttocks of Elias the Tishbite, who rose to heaven in a fiery chariot? Would you also like me to throw in a finger of the archangel Michael? I will most gladly, and the invective goes on and on. I think this was just one of the battles that was happening in Byzantium. And actually, what had happened was that when I took over the Byzantine section, it was going to be only about 30 or 40 pages. It turned to a major part of that anthology because we just suddenly realized that there's so much more there than we expected. Even though all of the editors, Mike Keeley, Edmund Keeley, Rachel Haddis, Karen Van Dyke, I mean, we specialize in Greek, but we were still surprised somehow. My first experience in translation was decidedly unclassical. As in the 1980s, I'd specialized in documenting and translating Japanese street slang. My first book was called Japanese Street Slang, in fact, and aimed to document Japanese language that had not before been reduced to writing, as they say. Language that had not been captured and interpreted. The language of Japan's drug trade, prison slang, its gang speech, in all its surprising specificity. Translating the many examples of natural speech was my first insight into translation as being mimicry. How might a Yakuza gang member's comment about a prison break or gun running sound in English? Or how does one mimic Japanese criminals discussing flamethrowers, flash bullets, or hand grenades? And interestingly, in Japanese, like in French, Verlaine, like Lambert, Japanese does the same thing with the same kind of effect. Though translating the classics has been a central part of my work, I've always been particularly interested in the neglected, forgotten, or untranslated works of major and interesting authors. My very first translation project was 6 early stories of Thomas Mann, stories that had not been translated into English and that added an important new perspective to Thomas Mann's work. And my second project was a neglected Siberian notebook of Dostoevsky that he had written in his early 30s while he was a political prisoner in a Siberian labor camp in Omsk. In the notebook, he recorded the snippets of dialogue he overheard in the camps, the cryptic and colorful peasant speech and criminal slang of the Russians, Ukrainians, Tatars, and Jews with whom he was interned. He wrote these entries on scraps of cardboard and paper, which he then sewed together with coarse string. As a new inmate, Dostoevsky would have had to learn the extreme and often unintelligible prison camp slang. To walk down a green road, for instance, meant to be flogged with many lashes. I don't know if we still say that in Russian or not, but it's probably quite cryptic. To walk down a green road. Yeah. Iron beaks were the inmates from the ranks of the nobility, as was Dostoevsky, so the iron beaks. In an important way, the Siberian Notebook is a distilled prison autobiography. Although Dostoevsky left absolutely no trace of himself in the entries, he never mentions himself or expresses any personal opinions, he mapped out his experience through the disconnected statements of the many characters he encountered. It would have been dangerous for him to write more personally. The notebook was written in such a way that had it been discovered, there would have been no clues to who had written it, the identity of the author. Among Dostoevsky's notebooks, the Siberian Notebook had a particularly strong influence on his later writing. The real living speech of his characters in his novels was very important to him, and he used these entries extensively in his later novels. In the first chapter of Memoirs from the House of the Dead, or Memories of Memoirs, the narrator sums up the moral precepts of the prison camp of the novel with a line from the Siberian Notebook. You didn't listen to your father and mother, so now you can listen to the hide of the drum. Another entry from his notebooks, Stop aping foolish pranks, reappears in the mouth of an enraged monk in the Brothers Karamazov. One of my major translation projects of the past 2 decades has been translating some 120 short stories by Anton Chekhov, stories that have been neglected, many of which had not been translated into English. Anton Chekhov's writing career lasted for just over 20 years, from 1880 to 1903. But during these years, he wrote over 700 novellas, short stories, shorts, most of them when he was in his 20s, 4 great plays that have made him the father of the modern theatre, and a number of comical one-actors. His motto was write as much as you can, write till your fingers break. And that is what he did, which is why we still have so many stories that have not been translated. Often the Moscow and St. Petersburg weekly magazines, which had a readership throughout Russia, published more than one piece by him in each issue. And these pieces appeared under whimsical series of pen names, such as A Man Without a Spleen, Shampansky, Wrenchnut No. 6, and names like that. Chekhov's early work is innovative, lively, and exciting. It's experimental before its time. Aside from stories that he also wrote in the more traditional form, Chekhov wrote stories in the form of census reports, statistical surveys, diary excerpts, stories in the form of lists of mathematical problems, Lonely Hearts advertisement, mini plays. He even wrote a one-page love story in the form of a legal deposition with a place in the upper left-hand corner for the government stamp. What I find particularly interesting about these stories is that at first glance they could indeed be mistaken for humorous, nonsensical turns or vignettes. But there is often something ominous, something Chekhovian going on just beneath the surface. To conclude, I would like to read a short excerpt from one of these stories that is written in the form of a homework assignment by a schoolgirl named Nadia, a flighty teenager. Her schoolmaster's name is Chechonte, one of Chekhov's pen names at the time. much of the comedy comes from Nadia's faulty language and spelling mistakes, and the cutting and pasting plagiarism that she does in order to pad her essays in the hope of getting a better grade. But if one reads between the lines, Nadia is living through ominous circumstances to which she is entirely oblivious. The piece is called Nadia N's vacation homework. So she's already failed her multiple choice tests, and now we're getting to her essay. And the essay is, how did you spend your vacation? The instant I passed my exam, I left with Mama, our furniture, and my brother Ioanni, a third-year lycée student, for our summer dacha. We were visited by Katya Kuzevic, her mama, her papa, Zina, little Egor, Natasha, and many other friends of mine, who took walks with me and embroidered out of doors. We were a lot of men, but us maidens kept away and paid no attention to them whatsoever. I read many books, among them books by Meshchersky, Maikov, Dumas, Livanov, Turgenev, Lomonosov. Nature was at its zenith, the young trees growing in rampant profusion, no axe having yet sought out their robust trunks, and the delicate foliage cast a breezy, all-engulfing shade over the reedy soft grasses speckled with gilded tips of buttercups, an azure spray of bluebells and crimson cloves. The sun rose in the morning and it set. Where the sun rose, there was a herd of birds. The herd was flying. There was a shepherd who was shepherding his sheep, and there were some clouds floating under the sky. Oh, how I do love nature. My papa was jittery all summer long. The evil bank wanted to take possession of our house, just like that. And Mama never left Papa's side, as she was afraid that he would take his own life. I had a very good vacation because I studied science and comported myself very well. The end.
Well, questions? Do I need to say more than questions? Yes, Jack.
A number of questions. I'll start with one. So it comes back to this last part where I was thinking about the visual element that you're describing. You talked about the legal deposition, lists, and I was thinking, well, how are you going to do that? Are you going to translate will the document be translated to something that works within the an English-American context, or are you going to stay within the confines of the foreign? And I hear a lot of foreign in what you just read. I felt the estrangement, which I didn't really feel as much in the Rousseau translation that you started with. And I was just wondering how, I feel the tensions in the first translation. It really felt very, of the very first you read. I could envision it in an American modern English, and what I hear here is this maneuvering within a foreign context. And I just wondered how that visual element also gets incorporated.
Yeah, well, so the story that was written like the love story that was written like a legal deposition was actually published in that book, The Unknown Chekhov, that I did. So it was published to reflect exactly what the Russian looked like. So it was a sort of it looked like a form. Now it wasn't exactly like a form that we have, but it could be a 1099 form, maybe it could be something like that. So in other words, it did look.
It was recognizable.
It was recognizable, but not in the sense, oh, this is a 1099 form, or this is this or that. So, and in fact, that came up yesterday in the workshop because I think things should sound. I would like this to sound the way it would if Chekhov had maybe written it in English, and yet I guess, as we said yesterday, yeah, but do we want it to make it sound like it was written in Brooklyn, for instance, Right. So I guess there is always that slight foreignness that remains. But I personally try to avoid giving a text a foreignness as a stamp that this is a translation. I would like it to have a natural rhythm to the extent that it can in English, something that really sounds as such. But the census reports and all those things, I try to make them look like census reports or Lonely Hearts column things, with little dots and layout.
stories for writing a lot, of course, and a lot of it he was doing to make money. So
Yes.
I imagine there would be, they would not all be stellar, pieces. So were you the one making decisions which to translate, which to include in that?
Well,
and what were your criteria?
Well, initially, my criterion, and it often is the case that I would choose things that I think I can do. If there are things happening in the story that I cannot bring into English, then I would try to avoid that. One thing I noticed was that I think I've become a little bit more daring because when I continued working on the Chekhov stories, I then went back and did some that I had thought that they would not work in English because they were so Russian, that there were so many allusions that maybe only a Russian at the time would understand, but maybe that wasn't the case, I thought, on second time around. So they were my choices. One criterion as well was that I was careful not to use the major Chekhovian models of the lady with the lapdog, something like that, saying, oh yes, but this Nadia end story, it's ridiculous. It's homework assignments, plagiarism. I mean, maybe we run into this nowadays as well. No, it wouldn't happen, right? So bits of Wikipedia ending up in Nadia's essay. So that's ridiculous. And the previous generation of Chekhov specialists would say as well that these things should be suppressed because they ruin the grandfather of Russian. But I think these are some of my favorite stories, and I don't think that they're badly done. He seems to have this incredible freedom in writing, that 3 or 4 pieces could appear in Askolki or in Budilnik, which were tough magazines. I mean, they were the New Yorker or the Punch of the day, weren't they? So he was very successful, I think, in what he did. So I chose what I thought would work.
I wanted to ask you about biography because it seems that you're very holistic as a translator, and your talents are a little humbling. I must admit to the rest of us that may not be quite as talented as you are, and as polyglot. But I was wondering. It seems like you want to get a sense of the sort of ecosystem of text that authors produce, and then that helps you to translate individual ones. But do you rely on biographies yourself, or is it more of an eminent biography that arises out of the text? So do you find yourself reading lots of biographies of these writers, or you construct it yourself?
I would have two answers to that. One thing is that I do seem to actually I am interested in biography, as Roger pointed out. I hadn't realized that the last couple of things that I did, meaning Augustine's Confessions, Solzhenitsyn now, Rousseau, that these were biographical works. So the last couple of years have been almost exclusively working with biography. I am, however, the kind of translator who likes to just take the text and work with it, which is a little bit dangerous, of course. I mean, there are 2 ways of doing it. One is to know all the works of Thomas Mann, everything there is to know about Thomas Mann, and then take a deep breath and begin. But that was not my way. My way was to start at the beginning and work, and then go back and clean up issues. And in other words, what is here, don't bring anything with you, just what is here and do nothing more. And yet, well, yesterday as well, as we saw in the translation workshop, the poet you were doing, there were important elements there. The fact that he had been to New York, that he was involved with Lorca. So things like that were important to know, but actually I noticed that in reading the translation, that, oh, this looks like Lorca. So in other words, you'd captured everything, and I don't know whether you knew beforehand or whether you came to it as such and found out as you were translating. So there is, one can't be too relaxed, I think. One has to try and see what's behind the text. So.
I'm just thinking, and I was thinking about that as you were talking about the old adage, that every generation needs its own translations. And I I worked with a writer who translated the Popol Vuh, but first he translated a word-for-word translation.
Mm-hmm.
And his other translation has somewhat ceased to be read, but his word-for-word translation is still, you know, very useful to everybody. And so I wondered how you feel about that. You know, what if you feel that your translations will stand the test of time? Just some thoughts on that.
Well, interestingly, translations don't age as well as the original text. I have no idea why that's the case, but that seems to be.
And especially the Quixote, you know, the Serpentine translations are just, you know, they really wear away very quickly.
Yeah. Now there are, of course, also different. I mean, each generation, for instance, from a Russian perspective, which in a sense I perceive as being my field, because I think. If you do a page count, I think I've done more Russian than anything else. But so Constance Garned, who brought all the great Russian novels in the Bloomsbury years, is often criticized today, but she is absolutely amazing, I would think, in the sense that she was aware of what the taste was at the time. Had she translated Chekhov the way he writes, the way we would maybe work with him today, with some of those stark, sudden moments, he maybe would not have done as well. So she wrote for her, she worked within her field, within her era, within her audience, for her audience, and was quite successful. Now, it might be a bit hard to read today, which is why people have, every generation have continued doing Chekhov. Now, my problem is that she translated, I think, some over 210, 211 Chekhov stories, and those are the exact stories that are always being retranslated. So my book was an antidote to that, as in, here's some new Chekhov, you know, read this maybe. But who knows in 10, 20 years if we need new translations. Now, I did the complete Isaac Babel, and I think you mentioned that somebody you know was translating a story of Isaac Babel. So I think that's good, the more, because there are different interpretations, and maybe I've captured some brilliant things of Isaac Babel, I hope. But if you translate, or you translate Isaac Babel, let's say, you might see some things that I couldn't, you might do a more literal or a more creative translation. So, lexical, literal, you know, as we said yesterday, there are various ways of doing it, and all of them are quite interesting. So I would encourage new generations to do new projects. If somebody today said, let's do a complete Isaac Babel, that probably would not work, because Norton is powerful, it has the rights. So we need to wait another 10, 15 years probably for that, so that another publisher might also dare to do competition. So in translation also a lot is depends on the market.
I'm going to go with the one Russian but are there other Russian translators whose work you follow and you like?
Well, you know, one thing I've realized, as I don't teach in a Russian department, unfortunately, I'd like to, but I notice with my colleagues who do, that they know the translation so well, and I think I probably suffer from the same malaise, if we want to call it that well, I don't know if you, do you read a lot in translation, or do you go directly to the original?
I read it in the original, but I have to, if I teach something, I have to
Then you, right.
Or I get a question, which translation to go with.
Yes.
And
So I think, you see, in that sense, you probably have a stronger view on that, maybe, because the fact that you teach these works in translation sometimes, that you have to actually choose whether you're going to go with Pavel Volokhonsky, or if you're going to go with an older text, or Makashak, or one of the others. I would probably say that, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know what to say about that.
I was just wondering if
I also would say that I would do things differently to the way things are being done. So maybe I shouldn't comment, you know.
really quickly building off of that, to what extent are you directly influenced by previous translations of a work, and to what extent does that lead you perhaps to resist translating certain passages a certain way, given that they've perhaps already been done in that manner, or?
Yeah, well, actually, that came up yesterday in our translation workshop too. There are really two ways of doing it. One is maybe a bit more of a scholarly way, which is to have everything there. Let's say if I'm translating The Lady with the Lapdog, which I haven't done, but let's say if I did, as a scholar, I would maybe have the 20 or 30 versions and look at what everyone's doing. Now, I don't do that, though, because, well, first of all, let's say in the Chekhov stories, there were no other translations. In Babel, there were, but I don't want to look over someone else's shoulder. And if I have a real problem, what I would do is I might look at a German translation and see what they've done. And in fact, I did do that for Isaac Babel. So I looked at Peter Urban's translation. I would say whenever I had a problem, he seemed to have one too. So the other, what I then did is, as we said yesterday, I had two Russian editors, and I just read word after word, and they would say stop, you know. So everything was checked that way, to see that idioms weren't escaping me somehow, or that I might not make something sound absolutely interesting when it's in fact a very typical Russian idiom. I mean, I would hope that wouldn't happen to me, but let's say with Isaac Babel, that is particularly dangerous, because you sometimes can't tell when it's no longer an idiom and when he's actually doing something like deconstructing the language somehow.
Oh, I'm sure this is something that you talked about in the workshop, which I'm very sorry that I couldn't attend, but can you talk a little bit about your strategy of dealing with prosody? I mean, when you're translating verse, you have this whole other problem, right? Or maybe not, I don't know. I mean, you're dealing with prose rhythms too, but if you're translating something that is very strictly metered from, Greek, for example, do you have an attack that you use? Does it depend on the piece itself? How has that worked?
Well, so for the I'm a little bit timid about some people yesterday in the workshop were more daring, I would say, than I would be. But because I think there also is an academic interest in certain pieces. So when rhythm, rhyme, meter are the main thing, or very important aspect, a protagonist within a piece, then I wouldn't do it. I've never translated rhyme. Actually, the only rhyme things I've translated are Chekhov making fun of poets trying to rhyme, because then it's really, like in wafting cigar smoke, thine whatever came unto me, and this sort of thing. You tripped and fell in one fell stroke. So that sort of thing. It wasn't quite like that, but anyway. Rhythms within prose, I think, are very, very important. I saw that particularly in Machiavelli, where timing, it was almost like the Commedia dell'arte or British comedy, where you can see that a joke is coming, things slow down, and then wallop, and he would do that. I remember in The Prince, where he says he would never comment on the papacy, because it's a principality that has been chosen by God, so I will not comment upon it. And then he says non di manco, however, and then there's this flash flood of annihilating criticism. So that's important to see that rhythm. You can see he's slowing down everything. The retardierende Moment, as we say in German. So he slows everything so that he can then go for it, So to that extent, yes. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about, we are in a class where we're reading, do you know Marianne Moore's translations of La Fontaine?
No, I don't know.
They're sort of crazy translations, and her thing was not only would she translate not only will she translate rhyme when there's rhyme, but she wanted to use the same type of rhyme. So she'll use an open A vowel rhyme. So she creates these things that are sort of strange, right? I mean, they're very, and sort of impossible. But it's a sort of it's a lovely idea. I don't know how well it works, but it's.
Yeah, well, you know, there are so many approaches, and one of the dangers of doing rhyme and meter is that then you're moving away from the meaning. But if that's not that important, then that's maybe okay. But it's not been something that I would say that I've ever developed or really had an ear or eye or pen for.
It's kind of connected to a question I wanted to ask that came up at the workshop yesterday. You answered when you were asked how do you choose the Chekhov and that mountain of work, and you said that you chose stuff that you could do, that could be done. I'm wondering if there aren't works that can't be done, or is it that you can't do them but another translator can? You know, there's always a translator for something. Or are there some things that should be left alone? And the example I mentioned yesterday was this Japanese translation of Finnegan's Wake that took about 15 years. And do you feel as a translator that some things you should just leave alone?
Well, yes, but it's not the way you're saying.
Such works exist?
No, I think that we all have our range and our specialty. So where many translators run into trouble is if they can't tell where their limits are or what the text is doing. So let's say Rilke, everyone loves it, it's beautiful, it's simple, and let's go for it, but it's murderous, and I would never touch any of that myself, you know?
But there's always someone who can do it.
One often finds also young translators doing it, and
they have no fear.
Or, you know, I think Stephen Mitchell said that he learned German in order to translate Rilke, but you know, it's der des dem den, and the den, we know where it goes if German's your mother tongue, but if so it's a dangerous thing to do. It seems easy, but it's dangerous. I think Kafka is also very dangerous. I would never do that because, well, it's so simple in short sentences often, and it's all there. But there's so much happening, and I can't. And I know that that's important, and I can't do it. And a friend of mine, in fact, is doing now his complete diaries. I mean, unexpurgated with all the things in it. And I was really upset because I thought, oh, that's something I would have wanted to do. And we have the same agent. And then I looked at a page of the diary, and then I thought, oh, Gott sei Dank, dass ich das nicht gemacht habe. And because it's just, it's probably even more problematic than his work. So, die Moral der Geschichte is, I mean, the moral of the story is you have to.
So your answer is
there are
no.
Well, there are people. Well, no. So maybe those 15 years of doing Finnegan's Wake into Japanese are absolutely brilliant and necessary. But it seems that person probably had, I hope, had what it took to do that. I wouldn't. So I wouldn't do it.
You know, it turns into something else entirely. I think is the point I'm trying to get at. You know, of course it's worth it, but is it really translation anymore? Has it become something else entirely?
Yeah.
Yes,
Well, I think that's kind of you started with the act of mimicry, and you talked about it a little bit. Could you and you gave many examples, but could you? It's interesting because it suggests a bit of defiance. Could you talk about why you thought of mimicry as the idea rather than, I don't know, imitation or?
Well, it is maybe interpretation like an actor or dancer might interpret a certain role. So, let's say if you have a variation in Giselle, then Makarova will do it in a certain way. Kelsey Kirkland would have done it. I mean, to use ballerinas from the 80s, but they're it's exactly the same step, but it's done quite differently, and maybe that's exactly what that is. So maybe to interpret what Petipa, the original choreographer or writer, would have done, and mimic it, so that maybe in English it sounds exactly like it does in Russian. I hope. So with Chekhov, I mean the Nadia N story. I hope that when I read it or when it's read in English, that it has that the reader has the same reaction to it that a Russian reader would.
translations into different languages. I mean, when, for instance, I don't read Russian, but what kind of translation am I supposed to choose between English or French? What is there a kind of second degree translation?
Oh, do you mean is Dostoevsky better in French than he is in English?
Not better, but how can I choose? When I'm just trying to say, okay, I'm going to read Chekhov, how do you decide? Is there a kind of natural relationship between certain languages or not?
Ah, well, you know, I mean, I often, when I translate Russian, I often think, oh, I wish I was doing this into Greek, because
Yeah.
I mean, Greek is one of my mother tongues, as I grew up there, and it's a sort of heritage language, but not that I would translate it to Greek. But Greek is a language as Orthodox Christian. It has the same psychology many times.
Mm-hmm.
When you say something in Russian, you would understand it from a Greek perspective, not from an English. So I would say that set is better. And I sometimes wonder also, I have a feeling that also the French might also be an interesting, that it might be good, it might work well. German too. So, you know, I don't know. So I would say, I think probably the only answer is that if you really like a Chekhov story, you think it's interesting, maybe you might feel that, let's say, Voltaire, that they've captured something, that you're enjoying it. I mean, so read it in that, and then read it in French, and then read it. So it's hard to answer that, I think.
Mm-hmm. But I know that in France, for instance, some translators have started translating from English, for instance. They translate a translation.
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
So, and they say that the important thing is not going back to the original, that on the contrary, to some extent, they get more because they see through the lens of an other intermediary language.
Well, you know, I would say that that's a dangerous way to go. We also often translate from other languages in the States, meaning Ismail Kadare, the Albanian, is almost always translated from French. Now, one of the problems there is that Yusuf Rioni, who's a wonderful translator, I don't know whether it's a French way of doing things, but it's softer. I mean, Kadare has a harshness, an Albanian harshness that makes him so interesting. In French, he's softer. Now, the story is still absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
So when we translate the soft French version, we lose that starkness. The translator who uses the French cannot see because it's not there. And that's why the lens can be interesting, maybe the way I mentioned earlier, I think personally, that if I have a problem translating Candide, well, maybe not Candide, but let's say if I have a problem translating Dostoevsky, that I might look and see what the French have done or what the Germans have done to see if that might be the answer. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we should stop. We can continue. I want to get the wine and other little things, but thank you very much, Peter.
All right, thank you.
Conversation. Daniel, can you give me a hand?
So Peter, would you ever touch Thomas again?
Oh, and that's another very difficult. Yeah, no, I think
Because I
not.
was thinking as you were talking about conflict, that I think Bernhard would be, I love him, but I think he would be very hard.
I think so, yeah. No, Bernhard is somebody that I'd be also worried about, I think. I mean, it could be that those patterns and the repetitions that he does, it could be that might in fact be quite interesting to translate, but he's a dangerous writer, I think.